Hi, Burns. This is a continuation of my class on the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John D. And we are up to Theorem 16, which is great news because Theorem 16, as I've mentioned in some of my earlier classes, is the only known source of the analysis of the keyword or the LVX signs of the adept that is so commonly used in modern esotericism. It's used in much of Golden Dawn style magic, Thelemic style magic, AA magic, and I've even seen YouTube videos of people just out meditating in the sun and doing the LVX sign. LVX, of course, being Latin for light. Anyway, this is the only known source of that theorem. So let me share my screen here and we'll get started. Of course, as you know by now, I'm assuming you know who John D is. I'm assuming you know what the hieroglyphic monad is. I'm assuming you watched the previous videos on the letter to Maximillian, letter to the printer, and the first 15 theorems. We left off with that great alchemical quote from ancient Greek, nature rejoices in nature, and you know all the connotations of that. So the playlist to this whole class is below. If you haven't watched those videos, please join us, but please take a look at the earlier videos. D is, of course, already symbolically built up the universe by taking apart and rotating around and flipping into 3 dimensions and then back to 2, his monad glyph. The world has then fallen and he is building it back up again and trying to resurrect that world as part of the Gnostic ascent to the one, or the Neoplatonic recreation of the Bonitatis, or as the restoring of the world that is part of Kabbalah. So please take a look back and see how we've got here, because there's a reason that the things in this theorem and all they refer to are given as signs of the adept. There's a lot of things you're supposed to already know. All right. Theorem 16 is rather long. This is just the first part of it, so I'm going to do this in 2 videos. I'm going to spend most of my time in this one talking about the first paragraph, although we'll get through this whole part here and we'll continue on with what comes after this in another video. So he starts out by saying, at this point in the discussion of our proposition, his proposition is the whole hieroglyphic monad, we must philosophize a little concerning the cross. The cross he means, of course, is this cross in his monad glyph that we have seen him take apart and put together several times. The rectilinear cross, where he has flipped these inner 4 quarters out and made a cross, flipped that into a cube. He has associated it with various things in terms of the Sephiroth. He's associated with the Sephiroth Malkuth and Tiferet primarily. But let's just take a look at these 2 words here. First of all, proposition. The Latin word propositum, just like the English word, means a general theme or principle that you're going to argue. In classical logic, it's the very first premise of an argument. However, in Dee's day, the English cognate proposition also meant something that was a parable, a riddle. So in that sense, he is telling you flat out that the hieroglyphic monad itself is a kind of parable or riddle or problem to be solved. It's also used that way in Latin versions of Euclid's Elements and in the English translation, which Dee famously wrote the introduction to. Let's look at this other word I have in bold here, or one of the other words I have in bold. Cross. That's crux in Latin, like the crux of the matter, the central part of an argument, sometimes one that it vexes one to solve, the crux of the matter. It can refer to a lot of other things in Latin, a crossroads, a frame or tree on which someone is crucified, like Jesus. And remember, in this Christian Kabbalah, what you are trying to do is become the Christos associated with Tiferet by moving back up the tree, just as you are participating in the Gnostic ascent of the one or the restoration of the Neoplatonic Bonitatis. It also can be, it's where we get crucible from. We've talked about things here with physical alchemy a lot. So what he's essentially telling you here, and this is important, that the crux of the matter of everything in the hieroglyphic monad is the cross and what he is about to do with the cross. Now, one could say, and it wouldn't be a pun, that within Christian traditions that the cross is the crux of the matter. But remember, he's talking about this with all of his reference as a Christian Kabbalist, a Neoplatonic Hermetic philosopher, and so on. Also remember back, is particularly in Theorem 6 and 8, he talked about the rectilinear cross, how you would get it referred to a ternary one way, then you displace the point and you get it referring to a quaternary. So he's going to draw upon all of those meanings as well. That's what the two straight lines, when he says, as we said, he said in earlier theorems. So the next part of this second sentence seems difficult, but it's right out of Euclid. So let me read it to you, and then I'll tell you what Euclid means by it. D says, although our cross is composed of two straight lines, as we said, and the lines are of equal length, they don't divide each other into equal lengths. Well, that's because they're supposed to be lines which would have infinite lengths. And in Euclid, a line is defined as a breadthless length. That's the first definition in Euclid. And its ends are points. That's the second definition in Euclid. So since D hasn't given you endpoints for these lines, they can't divide themselves. That's all he means by that sentence. He continues and says, but in the mystical arrangement of our cross, we want to have both equal and unequal parts, signifying that the power of the binary thus divided is hidden because they are equal in magnitude. The powers of an equilateral cross. Now, what he's talking about here with binary and why it's mystical deserves a little exploration. First of all, binary is a nod back to Plato's Timaeus, the world of being passing through the receptacle and becoming the world of becoming, where everything is in motion. He's correlated that, of course, to the Sefer Yetzirah, where one of the things we haven't talked much about in the Sefer Yetzirah is not only do the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, I mean, they create the world, but particular parts of the world are named, right? The planets, we discussed that. Elements, just like in the Timaeus. You can explore that also. And parts of the body, hands. So what do you have on each hand? You have a quinary and they make a decad. That's important. But also the binary can be each hand. In fact, it's described in almost that way in some translations of the Sefer Yetzirah, that you have between two quinaries a tongue, because it's the world being spoken into being. Okay. There are other mystical, particularly obviously Jewish and Christian interpretations. A very common one in the Renaissance will link us back to that last theorem, the explicitly sexual nature rejoices in nature, or D's using a gameia, gamos gaian, and alluding to the hieros gamos, or sacred union. The ecstatic union with light or the divine or the Christos is a common trope in Renaissance literature. A very spirit-filled person being referred to as the bride of Christ, just as one example. So that kind of sexualized mysticism that is so much a part of Jewish Kabbalah is denied in ways by some of the Christian Kabbalists. I mean, Reuchlin goes out of his way to have his Simon the Jew talk about how bo, a particular word, is not translated right. If you know the art of Kabbalah, that word. But D is not doing that. D is already even referred to grammatical cases as generative and punda word, kind of coined a Latin word, so you come up with a sexual meaning of it. Okay, when he talks about the equilateral cross down here, he's going to mean all lines being the same. We'll talk about some other reasons why throughout the discussion of this theorem, but let me just give you a very practical reason. For him to do all this flipping of stuff that he's done already, for him to flip this rectilinear cross into a square, to flip the square into a hexahedron, he's going to need to have it be equilateral perpendicular lines. The other thing is that by what he does with a square, as he is meshing that with his ideas from the Sephira, you will find a perfect match that Dee really couldn't possibly have known about. If you think of the thing that modern esotericists do with the cube of space, as popularized by Paul Foster Case and Bota, obviously Dee didn't know about that. It does fit. But the real question I have is, how aware is he of what is now called Merkaba mysticism and also some of the Hecalot mysteries? That's something that a lot more really needs to be explored. It used to be people thought Dee didn't even know the Sefer Yetzirah. Obviously he does. You can even just reverse engineer it from here, but we've also talked about how we know that he does. How much does he know about the others? Well, that's something that really we need further exploration for. Okay, a couple slides ago, you saw this graphic and another one where he is again going to be taking apart this rectilinear cross and putting it back together. So let's keep reading here. He says, most generally speaking, a certain justice of nature requires that a cross is to be drawn with equal straight and perpendicular lines, and in the decussation, lines ought to be equal to begin with. This word decussation isn't used that often in English, so let's define that first, and then we'll go back and see what he means by justice of nature. So a decussation of a line is just dividing a line crossways in the shape of an X. Remember, he had all that back in Theorem 8, and you got from that X, that was where he was flipping it into a square and a cube, so we had a hexahedron. You would get the same thing with a Merkaba, only you would start with interpenetrating tetrahedra, but that's, then you're in effect getting a star hexahedron. A crux decussata is a heraldric symbol. If you're interested in heraldry, it's again the form of a diagonal cross, like the shape of the letter or numeral X or the Greek chi. Now let's go back to justice of nature. First, justice. The Sephira that would be most referred to is Geburah, also associated with Mars. Remember everything we did in earlier theorems with Mars. And with that idea, that gets referred to the entire left-hand pillar, the pillar of severity. And if you think of in the Timaeus to intentionally continually change references, just as Dee is doing, you have the notion of the planets bringing much needed order to chaos. Well, the pillar of severity brings much needed order to that is needed so that the mercy of the other pillar doesn't just let evil run amok in the world. Also, you get connections here, as I've mentioned, to concepts like the cube of space and Merkaba mysticism. We know that he couldn't know about the cube of space. I'm convinced he did know about Merkaba mysticism. I'm convinced of that because of his later Enochian work, though, and you get the chariot mysteries in Ezekiel and things like that brought in, the Ophanim. So it's just one of many ways that the hieroglyphic monad presages the Enochian work more than anyone has ever given that credit for. But justice of nature. All right, remember everything we said about nature in that last theorem. Nature rejoices in nature. He wrote that out in Greek. Now we think of nature as just like, being out in the countryside or beautiful plants growing, but that's not what nature really meant then at all. The nature of a thing would be like the essence of a thing. It's an active order establishing force. Again, those planets that in the Timaeus are governing the chaos, or in Kabbalah on the tree of life, the higher Sephiroth that are shaping and giving forms to things so that you get, by the time you get to Yesod, the treasure house of images, you have forms created that manifest in Malkuth. Elemental characteristics, properties that define someone, and also the organs of generation and what they generate, including menstrual blood or semen. In terms of what Dee is doing, Dee is implicitly, well, he thinks they should be the same length and square with each other, because the Platonic forms that you contemplate, like the regular Platonic solids, that are in the world of being, you contemplate to restore order in the world of becoming, where everything is mixed up and you don't know what is happening. So those forms, by definition, are the same length. They're regular solids. And if we're talking about a square, which he's going to be doing all the way through here, they are square. All right. So we're going to go on to the second paragraph here. Now, this second paragraph is fascinating. We're going to set it up and put it on the back burner and talk about it in the next video, because this is where we have literally breakthrough mathematics. It's not the only place in the hieroglyphic monad, but it's the first place. So this is what he says. Secondly, and according to this norm of justice concerning an equilateral cross, for example, as in the 21st letter of the Latin alphabet, we will propose, after careful consideration, the following. All right, pause. Now, he has talked about this cross, as I've mentioned, in Theorem 8. If you don't remember that, please go back and see it. But remember, also in Theorem 8, he made such a big deal about an X being the 21st letter of the Latin alphabet of his time. It's not today, but of his time. And at first that seems kind of puzzling, right? 3 times 7 is 21. Yeah, right. Great. 777. Wonderful. But when you realize now his context of Kabbalah, 3 mother letters, 7 double letters. And when you get not to the next video, but the next theorem, 17, that will be very important when we see what he says the philosopher's stone is, which he will outright tell you in Theorem 17. Okay, so also X, as we have talked about, Roman numeral 10, referred that to the denary, to quinaries, the tetractys, the top point of the tetractys is a monad, and so on. All these concepts we've been working on all the way through. Now, let's look at these lines that I put in boldface. In the original, they're not in bold, but they are in italic. So it's worth asking, why is he putting this in italics? This is what he says. If a straight line were to be conceived to pass through the common point, that would be right here or right here, of the intersection of oppositely placed angles of a rectilinear, rectangular, and equilateral cross, the kind he's used to flip into a square and a cube, right? Then the parts of the cross on the other side of that dividing line are altogether similar and equal. Now, what he is doing, by the way, is just restating a proof that is in Euclid. But do you see what he is doing? He's inviting you to visualize the lines as 3 axes. You have a cross, and he wants you to have another line that comes in. Well, when you do that, you explicitly, rather than implicitly, like back in Theorem 8, you explicitly get 3 axes passing through the same point. In Cartesian geometry, that's the X, Y, and Z axis. And this, again, is right out of Elements. This is book 11. So that line that goes through, line being one-dimensional, if you make it two-dimensional, it's a plane. And if you know Euclid, that's the Euclidean plane of reference. We talk about that differently today. We tend to talk about that in terms of trigonometry, but you can describe the same thing trigonometrically. Now, as soon as you do this, as soon as you propose characteristics about a third line running through that point and realize, oh, that line is perhaps a plane, and then you start doing things with all these letters, what you are going to get is an idea that Dee has already spent 120 aphorisms exploring in another work. That's his Propoitomata Aphoristica, which you've heard me refer to before. The words Propoitomata Aphoristica just mean like basic foundational teachings, although it tends to be viewed by people in the history of science as a guide to navigation. There's a translation by Wayne Shoemaker with an introduction by J.L. Heilbronn, who is one of the big names in the history of science. That's what I'm going to be quoting here below. So what he spends many aphorisms on in the Propoitomata is how a ray emanating from a celestial body might affect another convex surface. So I'll just read you a quote from the Shoemaker translation of one of them. He'll say, a right cone, radiant and sensible, surrounds every sensible ray which emanates towards any external point from the body of any star and makes equal angles everywhere with the convex surface of the same star. The axis of the cone is the ray. The vertex is the external point. The base, finally, is that luminous portion of the convex surface of the same star which is nearest to the said vertex and is bounded by the circumference of a circle described by the end of a straight line drawn from the said vertex to the star and which barely touches the star. That's not the only theorem where he's exploring conic sections in the Propoitomata Aphoristica. In fact, from theorem 30 on, he is repeatedly dealing with conic sections, how light exerts forces upon the earth, basically. And he gets into the properties of luminous cones, their axes, their bases, their vertices, the strength they exert upon the earth. And it's also, as Heilbronn says in his preface to the Propoitomata, it's looking at kind of astrology as an applied science, which in Dee's day it was. Okay, so it's really important, really, really important that when he talks about this, about what you see in front of you in italics, that you visualize it. So can you visualize it? I'll read it again. If a straight line were to be conceived to pass through the common point, this point, and the line's going through this way. If it passes through the common point of the intersection of oppositely placed angles of a rectilinear, rectangular, and equilateral cross, then the parts of the cross on the other side are altogether similar and equal. If you can visualize that, awesome. You're not going to have trouble with the rest of this theorem in part 2, which we'll get to in the next video. What you're going to do now, though, is take that visualization and kind of put it on the back burner, and we'll go through the rest of this theorem, which, after everything we've just said, should seem kind of easy, kind of even, well, cute almost. So Dee says their forms are the same as the letter of the Latins that is accepted to be the fifth vowel. It is both of these. Their forms are the same as the fifth vowel. That's U, but in Dee's time, they wrote it as a V. V is also the Roman numeral for 5, and it's half of X, right? So this V, Roman numeral 5, half of X, right there. So it's accepted to be the fifth vowel, was most commonly used among the most ancient philosophers of the Latins to denote the number 5. And I think this was by no means done by them senselessly, since it takes the shape of half of our denary. There it is, X, 10. Made of 2 5s, 2 V's. From this form, therefore, duplicated, as you see here, as a result of the hypothetical division of the cross, both of which represent the quinary, 5, although one is upright and the other is upside down, we're admonished that it portrays a multiplication of the squaring of a square root, which marvelously falls upon a circular number, namely the quinary. That may sound confusing at first, but you can simply solve that one with Wikipedia. Look up what a circular number is, and you'll find that it's now usually called an automorphic number, but it's a natural number where the square ends in the same digit as the number being squared, like 1 times 1 is 1, or 5 times 5 is 25. So the 5 at the end of 25 is the same as what was squared, 5, or 6 times 6 is 36, and so on. Now we know that Dee is very interested in the challenge of the 3 classic problems of ancient Greek geometry, one of which is the squaring of the circle. So we might suspect he's going to do something with this notion of a circular number and a square, squaring of something circular. And indeed he will, although it may not be what you think, and he won't completely, we won't finish this until the next video at the end of this theorem. So for now, we'll just keep going on. He says, from this, it definitely is not senseless that 20 and 5 are produced, or that letter is number 20 and is the fifth vowel. In other words, 5 squared is 25, or XXV. And so the X, each X has 2 V's. So XXV has 5 V's if you split each X and XXV into 2 V's. That's all he's talking about there. So we can continue into the rest of this paragraph. Now we will consider another aspect of this equilateral cross, an aspect situated the same as that of our monadic cross. We place under the former a similar division of the cross into 2 parts, as was done above. From this place, another letter of the Latin alphabet is revealed, which is a doubled figure. And you know by now, since I've said this is the LVX theorem, what this is. He's going to make that into an L. From this place, another letter of the Latin alphabet is revealed, which is a doubled figure. One is upright, the other upside down and backwards, from which the most ancient custom of the Latins has been used to represent the number 50. Okay, so he's just observing that if you tilt a V on its side, you have the letter L, which is the Roman number, the Roman numeral for 50. So what he's done is, by using different parts of the cross of the elements turned different ways, he's given us the letters LVX, or light, suggesting, of course, that light is the crux of the matter. Divine light as being emanated as emanations of the Sephiroth, as transferred through the receptacle into the world of becoming, or the let there be light of Genesis 1:3, which he began his theorems with. Okay, so he's just made light out of the crux of the matter, of the equilateral cross, sometimes called the cross of the elements. And again, think of those first few theorems and let there be light. Now, in the second part of this theorem, which I'm going to release today also, he's going to turn these into luminous cones, and then from that get what we would now call a hyperbola and a parabola, among other things. And he will look at how that cone of light exerts influence. All right, that's all I've got for you today, folks. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.